Hi everyone, and welcome to Fan Commentaries on Green with Evil Part 5, the final episode in this five-part saga. Episode 5 is probably the most beloved episode out of all of them because it introduces the final component of the Green Ranger, which is the Dragon Zord. It has a really great encounter with the Megazord. I said before, I prefer part 4 over part 5, but it doesn't mean I hate this episode. It's still a very good episode. It does have some flaws and little issues here and there because of the way they had to change the edit. But for the most part, this episode played out very similar to the original Zyuranger episode. I do like that they actually say, oh, maybe this is wrong. Does it, can it be the Green Ranger or not? They do, challenge it. And I like this. But the problem is that with PR, it tends to like, oh, yeah, maybe. And then, oh, no, everything's all good and everything. And no one really cares, which is what the comic book really elaborates on because even though Tommy is good and he was turned to evil by the spell, no one really cared to like say, do we trust this guy still? Oh, I always hated this whenever they, censor this type of stuff inside a kid's show. It's always censored in a very poor, obvious way. Even till today, Power Rangers still does it. Even in Samurai, the medicine is actually sake inside there, and it never made sense in Samurai. I do love this episode because Alpha is used a lot more in this one because in part 1 he's deactivated, part 2 he's still suffering from the virus, and then 3 and 4 he's just trying to get everything functional. So at least he was used here more. They acknowledge it, especially at the end. He's commended. That's what I like about Alpha. They tend to overlook him because Billy kind of, takes more of the spotlight in this area. Now, I love this because technically Ernie is actually watching an episode of Zyuranger. The actual footage from the episode is playing throughout the scene. We don't see most of it because, you don't want to see that material, so I cut away from it from this angle. If you look closely in the background, you can see Boy's head just as it passes over. This I wish more of PR would show and elaborate because they don't show news reports of, the attacking, in the city, how people react. It's something that just gets overlooked. I found this kind of odd because, Tommy's evil here. He doesn't really care about rules and courtesy. It always bugged me. It's just like, I think in the real world, if this was under more serious circumstances, the Green Ranger would have attacked her and it wouldn't have cared who was there. He doesn't care who knows the secret identity. He's just under a spell and his goal is to kill all the Rangers. Now, this is footage from Ju 1.5. They needed a little bit extra here because this episode is mostly with Burai. That's the reason why certain things don't add up because in the original episode, like specifically here, Burai gets the Juso Ken, which never gets introduced to us technically. We just see him, play the flute for this big reveal of the Dragon Zord, and they had to cut around it, so they had to add this, and that's why the Dragon Dagger just comes out of nowhere. This is probably the most reused footage throughout the entire run of MMPR. It's used over and over again. And unfortunately, they had to cut around certain things. Like the original edit in Zyuranger had, people at the factories, and they cut most of that out. And so they stole footage from future episodes in order to cut around things, like here's from another episode. So it doesn't play out as like perfect. Sometimes footage is repeated. That's why I never really cared for it. As I got older, I noticed these things, and it just came like, yeah, something's being covered up, and it's being oddly edited. But I still love the Dragon Zord reveal. Of course, it feels much like Godzilla. One thing I personally hated was that Burai / Tommy never went inside the cockpit until his final time as the Green Ranger. It felt such a waste. They spent their time building the cockpit and never use it. So I guess Zordon has a certain position where he's stored in his time warp, and he probably has that protected by passwords and stuff. It's weird though, because why wouldn't Alpha know this personally? He's an AI. It should be inside his systems. It's a little bit of a thing that's kind of cool, but then it doesn't really make sense. I always hate that they jump to that conclusion. Just because someone's evil doesn't mean they're under a spell. He could actually be doing this willingly. Just because he was nice in the first episode doesn't mean much. I'm surprised they actually said business district, because usually they try to cover up where it's the abandoned warehouse district. Now, a lot of this material was cut out because mostly the Zyurangers were running into the city, so there's not much they could have used. Now, in the original episode, Barza is trying to get the Daijujin and all the beasts out of sealed. What I found really interesting when I finally saw Zyuranger for the first time is that the music composer, Juan Rossaman, Shuki Levy, all the people that work on MMPR, they actually kept the original Zyuranger theme from the Juso-Ken. I was really surprised. Usually, especially with Saban in general, since whenever they bring Japanese products here, they never keep the soundtrack. So it was surprising that they kept the Juso-Ken's tunes, except for the lullaby that was used in that Kid episode. They kept it. They even adapted the, attacking flute song. If you see here, they were cutting around material, so that's why they repeated footage. There was people coming in, and of course, Burai didn't henshin at first, so that's why he came in. Now, of course, this was also heavily edited in the reversion / Disney edit of this episode. Whenever we see the missiles fire, they have to, they cut out those few seconds. Now, in Zyurangers, this makes much sense when the Zords come back to life, because Barza breaks the spell and gets them out of the floor. While when Zorda comes back, it doesn't make any sense why they magically come back just because he returns. It's like Rita's spell doesn't break or anything. It doesn't make any sense. I do find something cool here. When we see the close-up of Jason's Power Morpher, they digitally replaced the Zyuranger logo. It was the one and only time the MMPR crew changed it. I wish they had done it to the existing stock shot when he pulls the coin out. So whenever you watch this, it doesn't really make much sense why Zordon comes back, releases the Megazord. Now, the one thing I really love about the Zords is that they're practical models, and I always find model work in general, preferable more than CG. CG has its place. CG's great in a lot of times, but mostly it looks fake, and a lot of times they cut corners with this. But the drawback with models, especially in the 90s, there was no CG work at the time, so there was no way to get the other three Zords into the fight. So it's mainly relegated to, unfortunately, just a Tyrannosaurus. I would loved to have seen, Triceratops, saber-toothed tiger, especially the pterodactyl, all fighting and helping out in order to stop the Dragon Zord. This was oddly not censored in the Disney version. They actually kept it in, so it seemed to be okay if you shoot a Zord, but not, people. Now, in the original episode, Dragon Caesar, he technically has no choice of obeying Dragon Ranger. So this is the reason why in the episode you'll see Jason and everyone trying to, like, talking to the Dragon Zord and doing all these gestures, because at that moment Daijujin is trying to convince him, don't follow him, don't follow him. Bandora is corrupting him. Break free. And I still think, even after all these seasons and everything, I still think the Megazord transformation is my favorite one. It's because I appreciate the amount of work that has to go into doing this. I mean, there's so many different models they have to use. There's motorized versions, non-motorized versions. This is filmed in front of a rear projected screen. All this work just to get this sequence done. Now, this footage is slowed down, and I never really liked it. I know why it was slowed down, because a lot of stuff was cut, so they had to, extend it. It never really worked better. But if you watch the original Zyuranger episode, it feels much more fluid and stuff, because more of it's in here. Dragon Ranger and Geki are technically, you're arguing to each other while this is going on, so that's why we're seeing stock footage here. Of course, this is a famous scene because we hear fake Tommy saying, "No way," it's mocked for decades, and I don't understand why they didn't ever had Jason Frank to record that line. Everyone's assuming it was Austin doing that line. Now, the Sword of Darkness is not really the reason why Dragon Ranger was under a spell. Geki eventually got through to him to stop following Bandora, so the whole sword being destroyed thing is not really necessary. That's the reason why we shoot new material for hours. And now, this I always annoyed. Remember how in the previous episodes he had this energy ball effect and they never used that ability again? Here's another one where he can use the Dragon Dagger to actually power up the shield to deflect energy beams and or other attacks. We never see that special attack at all ever used. Not even by Jason with the shield. This scene plays relatively the same in Zyuranger. Geki eventually convinces Burai to stop being evil, stop following Bandora. The one thing I found odd, and I thought MMPR did, was that at the end, they remorph and Zordon introduces them to Dragon Zord battle mode. And I thought that was a MMPR thing, but no, Zyuranger actually did the same thing. It always felt out of place. It was forced, and it was just basically an example of PR being a toy commercial, which for the most part, they're really good at not making the show feel like a toy commercial. It's still an adventure action show, and you just enjoy it because they're doing fun work and amazing, effects and all this fun stuff, and the story's cool. But in this case, this screams toy commercial. Of course, we get the first time we see the morph with Tommy, and I always wondered why they went with Dragon Zord when everyone else always just says their dinosaur name. I guess Dragon sounded boring, so they just had it as Dragon Zord. If you watch the Zyuranger episode, Bars is actually telling them to summon this combination. This technically is my favorite alternate mode from all the Zords over the years. I don't know, I just love this because it's Dragon Zord, but it has the fighting ability of the Megazord with the three of them. Although the one thing I hate is that the Pterodactyl has no bonus combining function with any other mode. And it's especially more annoying because in MMPR's case, Kim and Tommy were a thing, and her Zord was the one that was omitted. It felt wrong. Too bad they couldn't think of a way to get like the Tyrannosaurus and the Pterodactyl into some sort of sub-combination. Because the Pterodactyl mainly gets ignored because, again, she flies. So it's just like, in those days, you couldn't do those type of effects commonly. Now, everyone has this constant problem of what is this mode called? Because so many times in the show, it's called something. Zordon refers to it as Dragon Zord Fighting Mode. The toy says Dragon Zord Battle Mode. And then eventually they do correct it, and they finally say Dragon Zord Battle Mode. But that is the correct name. It's just, I don't understand why that error happened. It's just like, it probably happens because Bandai is the one who comes up with the names, and maybe they didn't communicate with the names at the time, and so they just put a temporary name. This happens even in like Samurai. The Battle Wings Zord was named something completely different in the book. This is also the final time David Fielding voices Zordon in the series. After this five-parter, Bob Manahan takes over the role for his Zordon's voice, and he becomes technically the classic Zordon voice, because David Fielding played Zordon in a much more like, Merlin-esque leader, mentor, while Bob Manahan was more like stricter, to the point. They both played them differently. I mean, I don't really have any preference. And of course, David Fielding stayed on as the visual representation of Zordon. And of course, he continues the role today, since unfortunately Bob Manahan had passed away. Now, this five-parter overall was a great fun, story, and it opened the show up to more possibilities with evil and good, and what can we expect of this show. In a way, it saved the series from being forgotten about in 40 episodes.